History of the World by J.M. Roberts. Book 2, The First Civilizations. Chapter 3, Ancient Egypt. The calendar, though it owed much to the observation of the stars, must have reflected also in its remoter origins. Observation of the great pulse at the heart of Egyptian life, the flooding of the Nile. This gave the Egyptian farmer a year of 3 seasons, each of approximately 4 months, one of planting, one of flood, one of harvest. But the Nile's endless cycle also influenced Egypt at deeper levels. The structure and solidity of the religious life of ancient Egypt greatly struck other peoples. Herodotus believed that the Greeks had acquired the names of their gods from Egypt. He was wrong, but it is interesting that he should have thought so. Later, the cults of Egyptian gods were seen as a threat by the Roman emperors. They were forbidden, but the Romans had eventually to tolerate them. Such was their appeal. Mumbo jumbo and charlatanry with an Egyptian flavor could still take in cultivated Europeans in the 18th century. An amusing and innocent expression of fascination of the myth of ancient Egypt could still be seen in recent times in the rituals of the Shriners, the fraternities of respectable American businessmen who paraded about the streets of small towns on great occasions, improbably attired in fezzes and baggy trousers. There was indeed a continuing vigor in Egyptian religion, which, like other sides of Egyptian civilization, long outlived the political forms that had sustained and sheltered it. Yet it remains something with which it is peculiarly difficult to come to grips. Words like vigor can be misleading. Religion in ancient Egypt was much more a matter of an all pervasive framework, as much taken for granted as the circulatory system of the human body. Then, an independent structure such as what later came to be understood as the church. There were, of course, religious personnel, priesthoods associated with particular cults and places, and already under the Old Kingdom, some of their priests had status sufficient to ensure their burial in expensive tombs. But their temples were economic agencies and storage centers as well as the foci of cults and many priests, both then and later, were to combine their ritual duties with those of scribes, administrators, and royal bureaucrats. They were hardly what later ages would think of as clergy. Egyptian religion is best seen not as a dynamic, lively social force, but as a way of dealing with reality by managing different parts of an unchanging cosmos. Yet, even to say that requires qualifications. We have to remember that concepts and distinctions which we take for granted in assessing and even talking about the mentalities of other ages did not exist for men whose minds we seek to penetrate. The boundary between religion and magic, for example, hardly mattered for ancient Egyptian, though he might be well aware that each had its proper efficacy. It has been said that magic was always present as some kind of cancer in the Egyptian religion. The image is too evaluative but expresses the intimacy of the link. Another distinction lacking to ancient Egypt was the one most of us make automatically between the name and the thing. For the ancient Egyptian, the name was the thing. The real object we separate from its designation was identical with it. So might be other images. The Egyptians lived in symbolism as fishes do in water, taking it for granted, and we have to break through the assumptions of a profoundly unsymbolic culture to understand them. A whole worldview is therefore involved in appreciating the meaning and role of religion in ancient Egypt. At the outset, there is overwhelming evidence of its importance. For almost the whole duration of their civilization, the ancient Egyptians show a remarkably uniform tendency to seek through religion a way of penetrating the variety of the flow of ordinary experience so as to reach a changeless world most easily understood through the life the dead lived there. Perhaps the pulse of the Nile is to be detected here too. Each year it is swept away and made new. But its cycle was ever recurring, changeless, the embodiment of a cosmic rhythm. The supreme change threatening men was death, the greatest expression of the decay and flux which was their common experience. Egyptian religion seems from the start obsessed with it. Its most familiar embodiments, after all, are the mummy and the grave goods from funeral chambers preserved in our museums. Under the Middle Kingdom, it came to be believed that all men, not just the king, could expect life in another world. Accordingly, through ritual and symbol, through preparation of the case, he would have to put to his judges in the afterworld. A man might prepare for afterlife with a reasonable confidence that he would achieve the changeless well being it offered in principle. The Egyptian view of the afterlife was therefore unlike the gloomy version of the Mesopotamians. Men could be happy in it. The struggle to assure this outcome for so many men across so many centuries gives Egyptian religion a heroic quality. It is the explanation, too, of the obsessively elaborate care shown in preparing tombs and conducting the deceased to their eternal resting place. Its most celebrated expression is the building of the pyramid and the practice of mummification. It took 7 days to carry out the funerary rites and mummification of a king under the Middle Kingdom. The Egyptians believed that after death, a man could expect judgment before Osiris. If the verdict was favorable, he would live in Osiris's kingdom. If not, he was abandoned to a monstrous destroyer, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. This did not mean, though, that in life human beings need do no more than placate Osiris, for the Egyptian pantheon was huge. About 2000 gods existed, and there were several important cults. Many of them originated in the prehistoric animal deities. Horus, the falcon god, was also god of dynasty and probably arrived with the mysterious invaders of the 4th millennium. These animals underwent a slow but incomplete humanization. Artists struck their animal heads onto human bodies. Such totem like creatures were rearranged in fresh patterns as the pharaohs sought through the consolidation of their cults to achieve political ends. In this way, the cult of Horus was consolidated with that of Amun Ra, the sun god, of whom the pharaoh came to be regarded as the incarnation. This was the official cult of a great age of pyramid building and by no means the end of the story. Horus later underwent another transformation to appear as the offspring of Osiris, the central figure of the national cult, and his consort Isis. This goddess of creation and love was probably the most ancient of all. Her origins, like those of the Egyptian deities, go back to the pre dynastic era, and she is one development of the ubiquitous mother goddess of whom evidence survive from all over the Neolithic Near East. She was long to endure her image, the infant Horus, in her arms, surviving into the Christian iconography of the Virgin Mary. Egyptian religion is immensely complicated. Different places had different cults, and there were even occasional variations of a doctrinal and speculative kind. The most famous of these was the attempt of a 14th century pharaoh to establish the cult of Aton, another manifestation of the sun, in which has been discerned the first monotheistic religion. Yet, if there is a recurring sense of a striving after synthesis, it is often the expression of dynastic or political interest. Much of the history of Egyptian religion must be, if we could only decipher it, the story of the ebbings and flowings about the major cults, politics, in fact, rather than religion. Not only the pharaohs were interested, the institutions which maintained these beliefs were in the hands of a hereditary priestly class, initiated into the rituals to whose inner sancta the ordinary worshipper almost never penetrated. The cult statues at the shrine of the temple were rarely seen except by the priests. As time passed, they acquired important vested interests in the popularity and well being of their cults. The gods loom large in the subject matter of ancient Egypt art, but it contains much more besides. It was based on a fundamental naturalism of representation, which, however restrained by conventions of expression and gesture, gives 2 millennia of classical Egyptian art at first a beautiful simplicity and later, in a more decadent period, an endearing charm and approachability. It permitted a realistic portrayal of scenes of everyday life. The rural themes of farming, fishing, and hunting were displayed in them. Craftsmen are shown at work on their products and scribes at their duties. Yet, neither content nor technique is in the end the most striking characteristic of Egyptian art, but its recognizability, continuous style. For some 2000 years, artists were able to work satisfyingly within a classical tradition. Its origins may owe something to Sumer, and it showed itself later able to borrow other foreign influences. Yet the strength and solidity of the central and native tradition never wavers. It must have been one of the most impressive visual features of the Egypt to the visitor in the ancient times. What he saw looked so much of a piece. If we exempt what was done in the Upper Paleolithic, of which we know very little, it is the longest and strongest continuous tradition in the whole history of art. It did not prove to be transplantable. Perhaps the Greeks took the column from the ancient Egypt, where it had its origins in the mud plastered bundle of reeds, of which a reminiscence survives in fluting. What is clear apart from this is that although the monuments of Egypt continuously fascinated artists and architects of other lands, the result, even when they exploited them successfully for their own purposes, was always superficial and exotic. Egyptian style never took root anywhere else. It pops up from time to time down the ages as decoration and embellishment. Fluted columns, sphinxes, and serpents on furniture, and obelisk here and a cinema there. Only one great integral contribution was made by Egyptian art to the future, the establishment for the delineation of the huge incised and painted figures on the walls of the tombs and temples, of the classical canons of proportion of the human body. These were to pass through the Greeks, and European artists would still be fascinated by them as late as Leonardo, although by then the contribution was theoretical, not stylistic. Another great artistic achievement, not confined to Egypt, though exceptionally important there, was calligraphic. It seems that Egyptians deliberately took the Sumerian invention of representing sounds rather than things, but rejected cuneiform. They invented instead hieroglyphic writing, instead of the device of arranging the same basic shape in different ways, which had been evolved in Mesopotamia. They deliberately chose lifelike little pictures or near pictures. It was much more decorative than cuneiform, but also much harder to master. The first hieroglyphs appear before 3000 BC, the last example of which we know was written in 394 AD. Nearly 4000 years is an impressively long life for calligraphy. But the uninitiated could still not read it for another 14 and a half centuries after its disappearance, until a French scholar deciphered the inscription on the Rosetta Stone, brought back to France after the discovery by scientists accompanying a French army in Egypt. None of the classical writers of antiquity who wrote about Egypt ever learned to read the hieroglyph. It seems though enormous interest was shown on it. Yet it now seems likely that hieroglyph had importance in world as well as in Egyptian history because it was a model for Semitic scripts of the second millennium BC and thus came to be a remote ancestor of the modern Latin alphabet, which has spread round the world in our own times. In ancient world, the ability to read hieroglyph was the key to the position of the priestly caste and accordingly a closely guarded professional secret. From pre dynastic times, it was used for historical records, and as early as the first dynasty, the invention of papyrus, strips of reed pith, laid crisscross and bound it together into a homogeneous sheet, provided a convenient medium for its multiplication. This invention had much greater importance for the world than hieroglyph, cheaper than skin from which parchment was made, and more convenient, though more perishable, than clay tablets or stone slates. It was the most general basis of correspondence and record in the Near East until well into the Christian era. When the invention of paper reached the Mediterranean world from the Far East, and even paper took its name from papyrus. Soon after the appearance of papyrus, writers began to paste sheets of it together into a long roll. Thus, the Egyptians invented the book as well as the material on which it could first be written and a script which is an ancestor of our own. It may be our greatest debt to the Egyptians, for a huge proportion of what we know of antiquity comes to us directly or indirectly via papyrus. Undoubtedly, the rumored prowess of her religious and magical practitioners and the spectacular embodiment of a political achievement in art and architecture largely explain Egypt's continuing prestige. Yet, if her civilization is looked at comparatively, it seems neither very fertile nor very responsive. Technology is by no means an infallible test, nor one easy to interpret, but it suggests a people slow to adopt new skills, reluctant to innovate once a creative jump had been made. Stone architecture was the only major innovation for a long time after the coming of literacy. Though papyrus and the wheel were known under the first dynasty, Egypt had been in contact with Mesopotamia for getting on for 2000 years before she adopted the well sweep, by then long in use to irrigate land in the other river valleys. Yet she invented the water clock, whose basic mechanism was to undergo millennia of elaboration in later civilizations. Perhaps the weight of routine was insuperable, given the background of the unchanging reassurance provided by the Nile. Though Egyptians' art records workmen organized in teams for the subdivision of manufacturing processes down to a point which faintly suggests the modern factory. Many important devices came to Egypt only much later than elsewhere. There is no solid evidence of the presence of potter's wheel before the Old Kingdom. For all the skill of the goldsmith and coppersmith, bronze making does not appear well into the second millennium BC, and the lathe has to wait for the Hellenistic age. The bow drill was almost the only true tool for the multiplication and transmission of energy available to the mass of Egyptian craftsmen. Only in medicine is there indisputable originality and achievement, and it can be traced back at least as far as the Old Kingdom. By 1000 BC, an Egyptian preeminence in this art was internationally recognized. While Egyptian medicine was never wholly separable from magic, magical prescriptions and amulets survived in great numbers. It had an appreciable content of rationality and pure empirical observation. It extended as far as the knowledge of contraceptive techniques. Its indirect contribution to subsequent history was great too, whatever its efficiency in its own day. Much of our knowledge of drugs and of plants furnishing material, medica, was first established by the Egyptian and passed from them, eventually, through the Greeks to the scientists of medieval Europe. It is a considerable thing to have initiated the use of a remedy effective as long as castor oil. What can be concluded from this about the health of ancient Egyptians is another matter. They do not seem to have been so worried about alcoholic overindulgence as the Mesopotamians. But it is not easy to infer anything from that. Some scholars have said there was an exceptionally high rate of infant mortality, and hard evidence of a negative kind exists for some diseases of adults. Whatever the explanation, the many mummified bodies surviving reveal no instance of cancer, rickets, or syphilis. On the other hand, the debilitating disease called schistosomiasis, carried by blood flukes and so prevalent in Egypt today, seems to have been well established already in the second millennium. Of course, none of this throws much light on ancient Egyptian medical practice. Nevertheless, Egypt provides our oldest surviving medical treatises, and their evidence of prescriptions and recommended cures suggests that Egyptian practitioners could offer a mixed bag of remedies, no better or worse than most of those deployed in great centers of civilization at any time before the present. It seems that much emphasis was long laid on purging and enemas. Considerable preservative skill was attributed to practitioners of mummification, though unjustifiably, since the climate was on their side. Curiously, the products of their art were later themselves regarded as the therapeutic value. Powdered mummy was for centuries a sovereign cure for many ills in Europe. It is interesting too that Egyptians devised and used certain rudimentary contraceptive techniques. Whether these had any efficacy in reducing the risk of overpopulation and therefore of the likelihood of infanticide remains wholly unknown and speculative. Most Egyptians were peasants, a consequence of Egypt remaining less urbanized than Mesopotamia. The picture of Egyptian life presented by its literature and art reveals a population living in the countryside using little towns and temples as service centers rather than dwelling places. Egypt was for most of antiquity a country of a few great cult and administrative centers, such as the Thebes or Memphis, and the rest noting more than villages and markets. Life for the poor was hard, but not unremittingly so. The major burden must have been conscript labor services. When these are not exacted by Pharaoh, then the peasant would have considerable leisure at those times when he waited for the flooding of Nile to do its work for him. The agricultural base was rich enough too to sustain a complex and variegated society with a wide range of craftsmen. About their activities, we know more than of those of their Mesopotamian equivalents, thanks to stone carving and paintings. The great division of this society was between the educated who could enter the state service and the rest. Slavery existed, but it appears was less fundamental an institution than the forced labor demanded of the peasantry. Tradition in later times remarked upon the seductiveness and the accessibility of Egyptian women. With other evidence, it helps to give an impression of a society in which women may have been more independent and perhaps enjoyed higher status than elsewhere. Doubtless, too much weight can be given to the art which depicts court ladies clad in the fine and revealing linens which the Egyptians came to weave exquisitely coiffured and jeweled. Wearing the carefully applied cosmetics to whose provision Egyptian commerce gave much attention. We should not lean too strongly on this, but our impression of the way in which women of the Egyptian ruling class were treated is important, and it is one of dignity and independence. The pharaohs and their consorts and other noble couples are sometimes depicted too, with an intimacy of mood found nowhere else in the art of the ancient Near East before the first millennium BC, and suggestive of a real emotional equality. It can hardly be accidental that this is so. The beautiful and charming women who appear in many of the paintings and sculptures may reflect also the outcome of a certain political importance for their sex which was lacking elsewhere. The throne, theoretically and often in practice, descended through the female line. An heiress brought to her husband the right of succession. Hence, there was much anxiety about the marriage of princesses. Many royal marriages were of brother and sister, without apparently unsatisfactory genetic effects. Some pharaohs married their daughters, but perhaps to prevent anyone else marrying them, rather than to ensure the continuity of the divine blood, which could be achieved through concubines. Such a standing must have made royal ladies influential personages in their own right. Some exercised important power, and one even occupied the throne, being willing to appear ritually bearded and in a man's clothes, and taking the title of Pharaoh. True, it was an innovation which seems not to have been wholly approved. There is also much femininity about the Egyptian pantheon, notably in the cult of Isis, which is suggestive. Literature and art stress a respect for the wife and mother, which goes beyond the confines of the circle of the notabilities. Both love stories and scenes of family life reveal what was at least thought to be an ideal standard for society as a whole, and it emphasizes a tender eroticism, relaxation, and informality, and something of an emotional equality of men and women. Some women were literate. There is even an Egyptian word for a female scribe, and evidence of the existence of two such has been found. But there were, of course, not many occupations open to women except those of priestesses or prostitutes. If they were well off, however, they could own property and their legal rights seem in most respects to have been akin to those of women in the Sumerian tradition. It is not easy to generalize over so long a period as that of Egyptian civilization, but such evidence as we have from ancient Egypt leaves the impression of a society with a potential for personal expression by women not found among many later peoples until modern times.